Today's speaker is Jacques Berlinerblau. We are very delighted to have him, and he will be talking about the very important topic of what is secularism. And Jacques Berlinerblau is Associate Professor and Director of the Program for Jewish Civilization at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He has published on a wide variety of issues, ranging from the composition of the Hebrew Bible, to the sociology of heresy, to modern Jewish intellectuals, to African American and Jewish American relations. Professor Berlinerblau's most recent book is How to Be Secular, a Call to Arms for Religious Freedom. Please help me welcome Professor Berlinerblau.
Well, good evening, everybody. Hi. All right, so I want to begin by thanking my gracious hosts here at the Center for Global Humanities. I want to thank Ms. Elizabeth Bennett. I hope she's here. Thank you for extending such a warm welcome and for taking such good care of my son, who's right over there, Cyrus, age 12, Washingtonian. I want to thank Professor Anouar Majid for inviting me and for telling me about the Center for Global Humanities, which I find kind of a fascinating concept. And the more I think about it and I read the materials about the center, the more it makes sense to me. And this might sound like an odd segue, but one of the areas I work in is campus novels, they're called. Small World by David Lodge, The Human Stain by Philip Roth, The Groves of Academe by Mary McCarthy. And whenever I lecture at colleges, I'm always saying to myself, why isn't this like a campus novel? These people are boring. But speaking to folks on campus today, you're like the cast of a campus novel. Artists, architects, people with interesting ideas. So thank you very much for having me. And I wish this center the best. And it seems like it's absolutely booming, as is your city, Portland, which I will get to right now. The shocker for all of you, you might not have known this, I was actually born here. I was born in Portland, Maine in 1966. And my parents came here from Paris, France, and they worked at Pineland General Hospital. And some of you old-timers might come speak to yes, there was a knowing yes, or no, as the case may be. I'd love to talk to some of you old-timers a little bit afterwards and talk about what has now become, I guess, a sort of co-op and a place where they make jam and bread and stuff like that. But I feel very, very connected to Portland, and with my son, we spent the last 3 days here. And I was blown away. I was calling my mother, who hasn't been here since 1966, and she was saying, describe the town. I was like, oh, there are all these great restaurants, and there are all these craft shops, and there's jazz, and she was like, that's not the Portland I knew. So something has changed. Congratulations to all of you, and I think what you're doing at the University of New England kind of captures the spirit of that. All right, wonderful. Tonight I want to speak to you about an extremely important and complicated idea. I have often said that the subject of secularism is the most mangled and confused ism in the American political lexicon. My hope tonight is to clarify for you what the term means, all the things that the term can mean, and then kind of open up a discussion with you as to what its proper place is in our democratic society. Usually when I lecture on this subject, I'm way down south, all right? So I kind of feel like I'm coming home here in Maine. I am literally coming home and maybe figuratively as well. I do think the environment in Maine and in New England is much more congenial to the type of ideas that we will be discussing here, which is not any slight on the South, but they see secularism as a four-letter word, and I don't think that's necessarily the de facto position of this audience tonight. I'm going to start with a quick historical overview, and then I'm going to point to some of the misconceptions surrounding the term. Get ready for a very unusual presentation. That is my style. If I am anything, I'm idiosyncratic. We will career from anecdotes to discussions of complex scholarly debates to reviews of American political movements. I'm just a local boy from Portland, Maine, and this is how I go about performing my craft, so bear with me. If you have seat belts, put them on now. It's going to be a very turbulent ride, and we're going to cover a lot of space, and we're going to ping-pong between a lot of very, very different things. Okay, here we go. So Act 1. Throughout its clangorous history, the term secularism has been understood to mean many different things. As best we can tell, and I know there's students in the audience, so write it down, kids. The word itself came into being, as best we can tell, in 1851, when George Jacob Holyoake, his dates are 1817 to 1906, suffixed an ism, secular ism, an ism onto the back of an ancient stem. The word secular had existed in Latin and Greek and Romance languages for over 2 millennia. St. Augustine had discussed it. Thomas Aquinas had discussed it. William of Ockham, Marsilius of Padua, Martin Luther, they had all discussed something called the secular. What Holyoake did is he smacked this ism onto the end, all right, elaborating upon his neologism, his new word, in a book called The Principles of Secularism. The British freethinker, he liked to refer to himself as a freethinker, defined it variously as, here we go, making the service of others a duty of life, positivism, utilitarianism, naturalism, materialism, free thought, sincerity, to name but a few. Multivalent at birth, secularism has bloomed into an unruly concept. Nowadays, consensus about its meaning evades scholars, policymakers, and laypersons alike. So one of the things, when I was trying to figure out what secularism was, that was about 5 years. And then I had to figure out why so many people were confused, and that was another 5 years, all right? And I have now found my patient zero. It's George Jacob Holyoake, right, who defines the term in so many different ways that it's fully understandable that posterity took the term and ran in every imaginable direction. However, atheism was excluded from the definitions enumerated by Holyoake. As far as he was concerned, non-belief may be a personal tenet, but it cannot be a secularist tenet from which it is wholly disconnected. Now, this exclusion exasperated many of his colleagues. They were known as the Victorian infidels. The 19th century in England is one of it's actually the first moment of mass infidelity, all right, of people en masse, not elites, right? Lots of working class folks starting to question the idea of God, but in most particularly questioning received Christian dogma. So the exclusion exasperated many of his colleagues. I hold, thundered Holyoake's colleague and rival Charles Bradlaugh, that the logical consequence of secularism is the denial, the absolute denial of a providence. The subject of secularism, as we shall see, brims with ambiguities, ironies, paradoxes, and peculiarities. But what is utterly peculiar about Bradlaugh's definition, secularism is atheism, and Holyoake's definitions, the 12 that I ran by, is that few of their ideas had much in common with the 1,500 years of running speculation about the secular that preceded them. Nor did such reflections on secular matters were never previously correlated with atheism or anti-theism. Nor did such reflections prior to 1851 concentrate on the mainly ethical concerns that engrossed Holyoake. Since the final frame of antiquity, the concept of the secular usually figured in political discussions deeply rooted in Christian political philosophy and the vicissitudes of Western European history. One of the hardest things for my audiences to understand is the deep roots of the secular idea in Christian thought. It's always a head-scratcher. There's always a lot of Q&A. A lot of people say, how is that even possible? But this is what my work and the work of other scholars indicates, that the idea of the secular only originates in the Christian world, not in the Jewish world and not in the Islamic world, not in their way of thinking about the universe. So what's weird about Holyoake? Here comes Holyoake, and all of a sudden, he shunts the term into completely different conceptual space, right? As opposed to secularism being something about the relationship between church and state, Holyoake argues it's an ethic for how we must live our lives by science, by material means, and we must live as if there is only this world. And then 20 years later, his enemy or frenemy, Charles Bradlaugh, says, no, it's atheism. All right, so I don't know why the conceptual rupture occurred in the middle of the 19th century, but it's kind of a fascinating question for intellectual historians to ponder. Why did the word's meaning wobble so radically all of a sudden in the middle of the 19th century? Okay, so let's review. The secular as an idea has been discussed by Christian political philosophers since the time of St. Augustine in the 5th century. It referred to a part of God's world that dealt with worldly things. So what were the secular authorities for Christian thinkers? Well, the secular authorities had a God-ordained job. God-ordained job. Warfare, taxation, punishment of criminals, basic governance, what we might call healthcare, and all that sort of stuff. All right. Then came Holyoake, who we just mentioned, and he defined this all very, very differently as a philosophy of doing good things in this world and using science and reason as the drivers of such activity. And then a few decades later, we got Bradlaugh, who said it was atheism. No wonder we're totally confused. All right, that's the end of Act 1. Now we're going to fast forward to the 21st century, where many of us like to be. So here we go. On January 8th, 2012, at the NBC News Republican debate in Concord, New Hampshire, Senator Rick Santorum issued a scathing denunciation of Barack Obama's secular ideology, which, according to Santorum, quote, goes against the traditions of our country and what works. Later in the same debate, however, in response to a question on whether he saw the current government of Pakistan as a theocracy, Santorum responded that he was hopeful of, quote, maintaining a more secular state than is in place in Pakistan today. Strange, right? So he accused Obama of having a secular ideology and excoriated him for that, but he wanted secularism in Pakistan. Okay, let's continue. Washington Tales, right? On February 10th, 2011, at a House Intelligence Committee hearing, Representative Sue Myrick questioned James Clapper, Director of National Intelligence, about the threat posed by the Muslim Brotherhood. James Clapper opined that the Muslim Brotherhood is not an extremist group, and went on to say that the term Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was a very heterogeneous group, largely secular, which has eschewed violence and has decried al-Qaeda as a perversion of Islam. Later that day, his office, this is a Washington expression, well, they walked it back. Right? Jamie Smith, director of the Office of Public Affairs for the Director of National Intelligence, issued a statement to clarify Director Clapper's point. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood makes efforts to work through a political system that has been, under Mubarak's rule, one that is largely secular in its orientation. He is well aware that the Muslim Brotherhood is not a secular organization. Then I gave a lecture at the State Department this past summer, and it was an off-the-record thing for the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, I think it's called, and all these very, very sophisticated policy analysts were sitting around. I was giving them roughly the same lecture, roughly the same factual platform, and the only question they kept asking me, I thought it was very, very funny, was, well, my ambassador was invited to celebrate an iftar. Is that okay? Now, I thought it was very amusing, right? So these are some of the most sophisticated foreign policy thinkers, right? But what was vexing them, right? What was vexing them was this church-state issue. If my ambassador is stationed in a foreign country and it's an Islamic country and there's an iftar celebration, can we invite, can we attend that event? So there is widespread confusion. The confusion is not just on one side of the aisle. President Barack Obama also confuses the term. In The Audacity of Hope, he wrote, in reaction to religious overreach, we equate tolerance with secularism and forfeit the moral language that would help infuse our policies with a larger meaning. We lose elections, wrote Barack Obama, and hope for the courts to foil Republican plans. We lost the courts and wait for a White House scandal, all right, which didn't prevent Newt Gingrich, Mitt Romney, and Rick Santorum from referring to Obama as a secular socialist, the advocate of a religion of secularism, and one attempting to impose secular values on our unsuspecting republic. And then the final kicker. There's a group called the Secular Coalition of America. They're an advocacy group, but if you read their actual mission statement, it goes something like this. The Secular Coalition of America is an organization whose purpose is to amplify the diverse and growing voice of the non-theistic community in the U.S. The website advertises itself as a coalition of humanists, secularists, and atheists. An affiliated organization, the Secular Student Alliance, refers to its mission as organizing non-religious students. All right, if you're a little confused, I think that's a very, very good thing, all right, because the term itself is extremely confusing, and everyone is using it in completely different ways, right, and often with tremendous passion, conviction, and anger, all right, which makes debates about secularism really, really unpleasant, all right, if you kind of actually understand what the terms mean. What I'm going to do, because I forgot to bring my book, I'm going to read, I had my assistant send me my own definition of the term secularism from my book. I'm going to give you the definition now, and I'm going to close with the definition. So here's my definition on the basis of I started right after 9/11. We lived right across the street from the World Trade Center. We were living in downtown New York, and that's when I decided I wanted to write a book on secularism. So 2011, 13 years. All right, 13 years in the game studying secularism. Here we go. This is the best I can do. Can't do any better than this, folks, right? Secularism is a political philosophy which at its core is preoccupied with and often deeply suspicious of any and all relations between government and religion. It translates that preoccupation into various strategies of governance, all of which seek to balance two necessities: the individual citizen's need for freedom of and freedom from religion, and the state's need to maintain order. You're more than welcome to read the entire book to see how I trace the genealogy of that way of thinking through the Anglo tradition. There's a whole French tradition of secularism, which we need not get into today. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss popular misconceptions of secularism, and this is how we're going to try to get at what the thing actually is. Okay, misconception number one. We know a lot about secularism. That's the first myth. We know absolutely nothing about secularism. For the professors in this room, there is no scholarly history of American secularism. It's never been written. I tried what I called the first attempt to sequence its genome in the book that Professor Majid mentioned, How to Be Secular. I'm just trying to figure out what this thing is. I had very, very few resources to help me out, so I was kind of winging it along the way, and I invite the youngsters in this room to become professors and to wing it with me and to improve upon the framework that I laid out. All right, so there are major figures who I think are dancing with the secular. I'll mention some names here. In the Anglo tradition, Martin Luther, yes, that Martin Luther, Roger Williams, known around these parts, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. I think they're the five great architects of the Anglo secular tradition. If I had more time, I'd talk about people like William Penn. I talk about people like Samuel von Pufendorf. His name always cracks up my students for some reason, right? In other words, there are dozens of these figures, right? We would talk about the Treaty of Westphalia, right? There are figures everywhere, Hugo Grotius, everywhere, right, who are talking about the secular, but we haven't done the research, so we're a little bit in the dark. Misconception number two. Secularism is the same thing as secularization or secularity. Let me explain what the difference is, because you're going to hear those terms bandied about. Secularization refers to a broad historical process through which religion's role in society becomes increasingly lessened or decentralized. Now, this is known as secularization hypothesis. For the scholars in the room, we all know that the secularization hypothesis was beloved of thinkers like Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, Sigmund Freud, and we also know that ever since the return of religious actors in the 80s, 90s, and aughts, many people believe that the secularization hypothesis was wrong, that the world is not becoming less religious, that religion is not losing its significance in public life. Right? That's neither here nor there. That's a tangent to what we're discussing tonight. The secularization hypothesis is a theory about the eventual marginalization or disappearance of religion. Secularism is something completely different, and one would be well advised not to confuse them. Then there's Charles Taylor's massive 878-page book, A Secular Age, which I do feel I need to mention because he understands what he calls secularity as, quote, a move from a society where belief in God is unchallenged and indeed unproblematic to one in which it is understood to be one option among others, and frequently not the easiest to embrace. All right, so this is just a little warning. If you want to have good conversations about this, disentangle, disarticulate secularism from secularization and secularity. All right, now let's get to the real stuff. Misconception number three, secularism is liberalism. All right, the two terms are often coupled, though that's not necessarily the case. A liberal democracy is not necessarily always a secular liberal democracy. All right, sometimes you have to pry apart the secular and the liberal. All right, so let's think about what the classic at the core of all secular worldviews is the idea of no establishment of religion. Right? You really can't have a secular society if you have an establishment of religion. Yet two of the most secular-seeming societies on earth do have established religions. I refer to Anglican Britain, which we always refer to as a secular liberal society, right, as an official Anglican church. And interestingly, Finland, right, that darling country of liberals throughout the United States. And Finland kind of doubles down. It has two official religions, not one, all right? There are two established religions in Finland. So we have to be cautious about bringing secular and liberal together in that sense. Secularism and liberalism share a genetic link. And the name of that genetic link is John Locke, the early Enlightenment philosopher who wrote the 1689 a letter concerning toleration. But understand this about liberalism. Liberalism is huge. All right? If you're a true liberal theorist, you have to think about trade tariffs, representative or direct democracy, immigration, pension plans, ethanol subsidies, right? All secularism does, the one issue it focuses on are relations between church and state. That's all it does, all right? So think of liberalism as this immense project, right? And secularism as a very important platform or prong within the liberal worldview. Notice I didn't say separation. I said what secularism does is it thinks about relations between church and state because it is preoccupied by the dangers those relations present to liberalism. All right? So you can make the argument, and I do make the argument in the book, if you don't have secularism, you have an implicit threat to liberalism. Not always, but often enough. Liberalism thrives, right? Its default platform, right? Its operating platform is secularism. If not, liberal democracies run the risk of going to seed. Misconception number 4. We're not in the South, so we can disabuse ourselves of this one really fast. Secularism is not Stalinism, nor is it the Antichrist. So let's take those two in turn, right? In popular culture and polemics, and even some serious academic work, a frequently made charge in culture war brawls is that secularism is tantamount to Nazism or Stalinism, all right? One thing I want to say, I have no idea why people make the argument that Nazi Germany was secular. That is completely absurd to me, right? However, the argument that Stalin's Soviet Union had secular DNA is completely legitimate. All right, so I come here, Professor Majid and I, we're professors, right? Our job is to be objective and to call them as we see them. So it often upsets secular activists when I bring this point to their attention. Secularism does have a dark side, right? And the dark side, and New Hampshire is within sight if I understand, the dark side is a state gone wild, all right? That's why I mentioned New Hampshire, right? This fear of a big state that takes over everything, that regulates every aspect of your life, right? So I don't want to sugarcoat, nor do I want to come off as an activist or a proponent of secularism, even though personally I'm a secularist. I understand, looking at the Soviet model, what goes wrong in secular states, all right? What goes wrong is a fetishization of state power and a demand that everything be subject to the whims of the state, especially religious belief of all sorts, which is seen as subversive. So when somebody says to you, oh, secularism, that's Nazism, you can say, Professor Berlinerblau says you're insane, all right? But when somebody says to you, secularism is Stalinism, I think you have to reflect deeply and say, that's secularism drunk, all right? That's secularism on crystal meth. That's secularism out of its wits. And it's definitely part of the secular worldview. In the Q&A, I might be able to tell you a little bit about how the Soviet model is deeply, deeply indebted to the French model of laïcité, and we can discuss that. Not so much to the Anglo model, more to the French model. And the French model, I think, is a completely useful model. Okay, so what did the Soviets do? They augmented and fetishized the idea of order and freedom from religion. They took two pieces out of the secular puzzle And they aggrandized them to the point that this became the state's raison d'etre, right? To maintain order and to assure the absolute freedom from religion for all subjects. So they established units like the League of the Militant Godless. There's some excellent research that has come out on these groups in the 20s, 30s, and 40s that were going around giving atheist lectures around the country. Here's the funny thing. The League of Militant Godless, some incredible statistic, in 1955 gave something like 114,000 lectures, right, on atheism across the Soviet Union. And even then, 60% of the population claimed they still believed in God. This was under Stalin, right? Who tells a Stalinist pollster, all right, that they still believe in God? So if you want to know how effective the League of Militant Godless was, it wasn't effective at all. After the wall came down, you had religious Jews, you had Eastern Orthodox, Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses coming out of every beet cellar, right, in the Soviet Union. Why? Because the great lesson we learn from history is you can never eradicate a person's faith through violence or through coercion, full stop. It never works. On the contrary, it will boomerang and everything will go hellaciously wrong if your thing is eliminating religion and eliminating belief. All right, so this is one of the greatest lessons you can learn. So if you're the type of person, all right, that would like to curtail everyone's religious liberties, I implore you not to follow the Soviet model, if only so you will achieve your ends, all right? Because what will happen is precisely the opposite, all right? You will live in a society where even more individuals are religious. Okay, misconception number 5. Secularism is religiously neutral. This is a very complicated one, okay? People who speak on behalf of secularism tend to say, oh, you know, secular state, it's like vanilla, all right? It's totally neutral, all right? It takes no sides, all right? No, that's not true. Right? American secularism is Protestant to the core. All right? Let's think about who the architects were. I'll repeat their names. Martin Luther, Roger Williams, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. Well, Luther founded Protestantism, right? We all know about the great Baptist dissenter, Roger Williams. John Locke himself a dissenter, but you got a Protestant there, obviously. And even Jefferson and Madison, about whom we're very curious about their actual religious commitments, we know that they were well within the Protestant fold. Why do I mention this here? I mention this in particular for our Catholic friends, all right? Because what research is showing about the growth of the idea of separation of church and state in the United States is very, very important for all theorists of secularism to think about very, very carefully. Namely, separation of church and state, as it developed as an idea in American political thinking in the 19th century, was an idea that was advocated by nativist, xenophobic, anti-Catholic bigots. All right, there's no debate about this. All right, by the way, I've never seen anyone that says, no, that's not true. If you'd like a proof text, I would urge you to read Philip Hamburger, professor of law at Columbia University, his very important 2005 book called Separation of Church and State. Now, I do think Hamburger goes a little bit over the edge, all right, where he argues that separation of church and state must be completely abandoned because it is genetically, or in its marrow, it's anti-Catholic. I wouldn't go that far, all right? Nevertheless, the correlation between those in the United States who endorsed full separation of church and state and those in the United States who loathed Catholic Americans is incontrovertible. There's no discussion there. So if you wonder why many of your Catholic colleagues, right, have a sort of negative reaction or a tinge when the word secularism comes forward, especially in the United States, it has a lot to do with this very dark, almost completely popularly unknown history of separationist anti-Catholicism. Okay, I do think that's very, very important. So let's review. Where does the anti-Catholicism come from in these Protestant worldviews, right? All the Protestant founders of secularism shared some basic beliefs. The first was that Catholicism was a menace that needed to be done away with. The second was that belief in God was an individual affair. That's not necessarily something that Muslims believe. That's not necessarily something that Jews believe. That's not necessarily something that Catholics believe, right? So this very idea that when you think about God, it's between you and God. That's it. It's got to be a one-to-one sort of, it's a very Protestant notion. All right, so let's not insist that secularism is completely neutral. The third, Protestant assumption is the idea that freedom of conscience was sacred, right? Nobody can tell you how you can believe in God. Nobody can influence your thinking on God. Read Roger Williams, right, who is the great architect of the idea of liberty of conscience. Now, I agree with Roger Williams, but if you're a Catholic, let's say, what role does that leave for a priest or a cardinal or a bishop or a nun, right? They're there to help you understand God, all right? So please understand the deeply Protestant assumptions that undermine the Anglo-secular experiment. Okay, the text, I do want to mention it again because I don't think it's read commonly enough or widely enough outside of academic circles, is Philip Hamburger's 2005 Separation of Church and State. It's a bit of a slog, it's long, it's a bit repetitive, but the point is very, very well made, and it's something, as I speak to my Catholic students, of which we have a few, at Georgetown University, even they didn't know about it. I asked them, did you know about the Bible riots of the 1840s, right? Did you know about the Blaine Amendments, right? None of them know about it. So I think Catholic America, and I think this is a very healthy thing, has moved on, all right? It doesn't want to go back there, right? But any knowledgeable Catholic intellectual is well aware of this stain on American history. Misconception number 6, secularism. No, I'm not going to do that one. Misconception number 6, secularism is not separationism. This is the one that I do want to get to. All right, here we get to the good stuff. Let me give you a preamble first, and then I will try and dig down a little bit. When I ask educated students and educated audiences such as the one here, what is secularism? You'll always have one person, atheism? All right, so you get that, right? Then you get another person that says separation of church and state. And what I'll say is, yeah, that's one way of being secular, but that's not the only way of being secular. Separationism is one policy possibility within the secular orbit. I'll explain what some of the others are in a moment. So now we have to go back and understand where the idea of separationism comes from, all right? Strict separationism, as we know it, is theoretically born in Thomas Jefferson's 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists. All right, I'm going to read to you from the letter, and then I'm going to explain to you what some of the problems are. All right, here we go. Casting a melancholy glance back at the 1780s, Jefferson wrote, I need my booming cadence voice for this, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature would make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. All right, this is the 1802 letter, a private letter to the Danbury Baptists. Here are some fun facts. Jefferson never used the phrase separation of church and state ever again in any of his writings, and he lived a couple more decades. I think that's pretty fascinating. All right, separation of church and state never figured in Supreme Court decisions in any significant way until a very controversial case, the 1878-1879 Reynolds polygamy case. Right? Then it never appeared again until the 1947 Everson case, which we shall get to in a moment. So for about 150 years, the United States Supreme Court really didn't think very much about separationism. All right, and here's the third peculiar thing about this. Jefferson took the 16 words of our religion clauses, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. 16 words, that's it. 16 words, all right, to regulate religious relations between how many millions of Americans? We've got a constitutional crisis in the United States. Those words are simply not clear enough. Those words are not detailed enough. They are not rich enough to properly regulate relations between church and state in this country, but that's another quest for another day. Jefferson is the one that believed those words referred to separation of church and state and demanded a wall of separation. The most recent research indicates that Jefferson and Madison were unusual in that regard. George Washington didn't believe this. Hamilton didn't believe. John Jay didn't believe this. The Adamses didn't believe this. In other words, they were outliers. They were way ahead of the pack. They had read way too much John Locke, and I'm happy they did because I think that was a good idea for the time. Nevertheless, the point I'm trying to get across to you is very many evangelical American scholars and traditionalist Catholic scholars have argued that separation of church and state is an idea that has no legitimate constitutional sanction. It appeared in a letter in 1802, a private letter, big whoop, right? Didn't use it again the rest of his life. Appeared again in 1878, 76 years later. Then nobody talks about it until 1947, and that is the age of separationist secularism in the United States. All right, so let's talk about that. Please understand what I'm trying to say. I'm not an opponent of secularism. I just believe its place in American history is not properly understood. It's assumed to be a synonym for secularism. I repeat, it's one way of doing secularism. There are other ways which we shall discuss. All right, so when is separationist secularism born in the United States? By all accounts, it's the 1947 Everson case. And the more you read the Everson case, the stranger it becomes. Everything about the case is in reverse because it's a case that actually permitted government funding for Catholic school children to be bused off their campuses to Catholic schools. Does that sound separationist-y to you? No, right? It's a very, very peculiar case, right? And many argue it had nothing to do with separation. Right? It had to do with neutrality. That was the overriding principle. You can read the great Martha Nussbaum on all of that. I will leave that for a discussion as we move forward. So what happened from 1947 to about the mid-'80s? Right? The Warren and Burger courts happened, all right, with their notably, these are post-FDR, right? They're notably New Deal, liberal interpretations of American democracy. And many have argued whether you like these interpretations or not, and I personally like them very much, all right? They're actually sort of new. All right? This marks a new phase in American history, a new way of thinking about the role of government, a new way of thinking about religious minorities, a new way of thinking about, oh, basically everything, voting rights, race relations, you name it, all right? Everything is new in this glorious period of American liberalism. As regards secularism, what are some of the major cases? Here we go. We have the 1947 Everson Township case, right? We have the release time cases, the cases in which children were permitted to leave school for 10 minutes to go pray. Well, you can't do that anymore, even though people do it all the time. That's McCollum versus Board of Education, 1948. Non-denominational prayer. Remember that? A lot of you, I'm just judging on your age, were shunted into a room for a Regent's prayer. That's what we used to do in New York, right? So all the kids would go into a room, and they'd say a non-denominational prayer, but the non-denominational prayer was always from the King James Bible, by the way. As I speak to Jews in New York, they tell me that there was a little ritual where the Jewish kids were kind of forgotten, right? So there was this kind of understanding in 1961 that time to pray, guys, and everyone would walk out, and the Jewish kids would stay behind, and maybe the stray Muslim kid and whoever else was in there, and they wouldn't pray, and nobody would make a big deal about it. Well, the Supreme Court got to that in the Engel Vitale case, which was kind of the Roe v. Wade of the 60s, right? And they deemed non-denominational prayer to be unconstitutional, though you can still have a moment of silence. So we'll talk about moment of silence as we go forward. All right? Bible reading to start the day? No, 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 no. That's Abington School District versus Schempp, 1963. And then there's the Lemon case with its inscrutable three-pronged criteria for what a government can do and cannot do, all right? Secular legislative purpose, no excessive government entangled with religion, and so forth. All right, so what do we have here, all right? We have Americans who, when they think of secularism, they speak of separation of church and state. We have secular advocates who are usually atheists now. And we have liberal advocates who, when they think of secularism, they speak of separation of church and state. The problem is that scholars have generally concluded that separationism is dead. When did it die? It died probably around 1985, when Justice Rehnquist pronounced it a bad metaphor, a wall of separation, based on bad history, and said it should be explicitly abandoned. And what the courts have done from 1985 to the present is they've simply moved away from separationism. Right? They don't think in terms of a wall of separation. And every legal scholar knows this. All right? You can't find a single American jurist who will say, oh no, the courts are totally in favor of separation. So what's the disconnect there are many liberal people, such as I imagine many folks in this room, who when they think about crazy things, right, that evangelicals and traditionalist Catholics do, say, don't we have separation of church and state in this country, right? And what some theorists are arguing, Martha Nussbaum is one of them in Liberty of Conscience, I'm another, is that's not a winning ticket. All right? There have to be new strategies judicially for understanding how to deal with, shall we say, the overreach of the Christian right in this country. Separation of church and state isn't working. It's losing and losing and losing and losing and losing. The Supreme Court has abandoned it as an operating or guiding principle. It's time for something new. To quote Antonio Gramsci, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. All right? So who is going to find this replacement policy for secularism as a means of combating the very well-organized, very savvy, very well-funded, and very legally, I would say, sophisticated Christian right in this country? Okay, misconception number 8. We're drawing to a grand finale, folks. The Democrats are secular. Interesting, all right? And let's use secular in terms of separation. Here we get to the good stuff. How about this? The Democrats were separationist secularists, and the high point of that was John F. Kennedy's speech, I believe it's September 17th or 22nd, 1960, Houston Ministerial Baptist Association, where he says, I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute. All right? Look at that as the high watermark of American separationism. An American president saying, I believe in this wall of separation. And it's not a coincidence that all those court cases, which I mentioned to you, right, the 1947 Everson case, the Warren and Burger courts are kicking into gear. It's not a coincidence that a president would say that. But let me let you in on a little secret. In the 60s and 70s, most Republicans are separationist as well. All right? The Democrats will say it loud and proud. Most Republicans, especially Republicans from the Northeast and the Mountain West, right, are secular also in the sense of being separationists. What happened? What went wrong? All right? Well, the Christian right happened. The Christian right re-enters politics not after Roe v. Wade, as is often assumed. All right? It enters a little later, I mean evangelical Christians, and it enters, paradoxically, with Jimmy Carter, an evangelical who they initially support. If I were to show you documents from the Southern Baptist Convention a few weeks after Roe v. Wade was decided, in which the Southern Baptist Convention says, yeah, sounds good, all right, seems like a good idea, would you be utterly shocked? All right, this is kind of the pillar of anti-abortion organizations in the United States today. Who was initially opposed to abortion, reproductive rights? Traditionalist Catholics. It took evangelical Protestants about 3, 4, 5 years to glom on. All right, and this was the genius of the Reverend Falwell. By the 80s, the white conservative evangelicals had embraced the anti-abortion approach, and the rest is American history. So what happened to separationism? Jerry Falwell happened, Pat Robertson happened, the reconfiguration of the American electoral map, and before you knew it, through an age of Reagan in particular, the old idea of a rigid separation between church and state was explicitly abandoned. And how do we know that everyone abandoned it? We know that everyone abandoned it when Barack Obama was elected. All right? We knew it even before he was elected. On July 1st, 2008 in Zanesville, Ohio, he gave a famous talk about the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. This was a George W. Bush idea. For those of you that don't know what it was, the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives was supposed to go something like this. Right? The government would provide funding to religious groups to provide social services. All right, that had been done for decades, even if religious messaging and proselytization was part of the service they provided. All right, it's one thing for the UJA and Catholic Social Services and Lutheran services to offer secular services to drug addicts, to open up a soup kitchen. It's another thing for a group to insist, while you're in the soup kitchen eating your soup, let's all pray and acknowledge our Savior, Jesus Christ. All right? What Bush did is he created the possibility of making this funding available to such groups. This is the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. Everyone thought that the Democrat Barack Obama was going to nuke it out of existence. And what did he say on July 1st? Right, this is about 3 months before the general election. He said, not only am I not going to nuke it out of existence, I'm going to make it even larger. All right, this is when you knew the Democrats had abandoned separationist secularism. What is the new Democratic policy? And now we start to wind it down. Accommodationism. What is accommodationism? Accommodationism is the idea that as long as a state funds every religious group in a non-preferential manner, it can do so. There's a huge debate amongst legal scholars whether this is consonant with the vision of the founders. I personally think that it is not. All right? But what has the Obama administration done? It has embraced the logic of Republican administrations that came before, and it's argued we as a government have every right to fund religious groups so they can do their religious good works, right? Methadone clinics, alcohol treatment, battered women's shelters, you name it, right? As long as we disseminate the funding equally. And the religious groups, they can do whatever they want with the money, right? And if they discriminate against workers in their program on the basis of the fact that they're gay, there's nothing we can do about that. This is where it gets very, very ugly and very, very controversial, all right? So accommodationism has become the de facto policy of the land. The question is it legitimately secular, and is it good for the United States? We're down to our last two misconceptions. All right? Secularism is atheism. On the contrary, secularism is a political philosophy about the proper relationship between church and state. Atheism is a metaphysical or anti-metaphysical discourse about the existence or non-existence of God. When did the confusion set in? Most likely with Bradlaugh in the 1870s, and probably Holyoake, who wrenched the term way out of its original context. When did the debate become supercharged? With the advent of the New Atheists in 2004. All right? What the New Atheists did is they took the word secular as their own. There's no dirty pool in that. They're fully permitted to do so. And the confusion, I noticed, ratcheted up in the last decade, all right, where the terms have become virtual synonyms. I would like to disarticulate the terms. I think atheism is a great thing. I have no problem with atheism. I'm personally an atheist. And I think secularism is another different great thing. But I'd like to make sure that there's a space for a person to say, I'm a religious person and I'm a secularist, right? And by that I mean I'm very, very worried about government meddling too much in citizens' lives on the basis of religious precepts and scruples, right? So part of my project is to disarticulate or disentangle atheism from secularism. And the finale. Secularism is anti-religion. I would say that that is a patently absurd claim to make, and it's probably the single biggest misunderstanding of what secularism is. The roots of the secular vision, as I've pointed out here this evening, lie in the Protestant Reformation and in the Enlightenment. It develops in the Enlightenment a Christian intuition about the dangers to order when church and state mingle. Let me put it this way. The great secular insight is this. Societies that permit too close a relationship between church and state, religion and government, are inherently structurally unstable. All right, so let's make it very, very simple. All right, that's the great animating secular genius. All right, that if you permit religion and government in any society to become too closely affiliated with one another, then eventually, down the line, nobody will get to God. Nobody. All right? And the example, of course, is the awful 17th century in Europe. All right? So let's try to understand secularism not as anti-religious, right? But as an ideology that argues, or a political philosophy that argues, in order for everyone to worship God or gods or goddesses or worship no God as they see fit, there has to be some type of scrupulous monitoring of the way a government interacts with religion and religious groups. That, my friends, is the essence of the secular vision. So I'm going to close, hopefully, having enlightened you and illuminated you so that you can better understand my definition of secularism, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Secularism is a political philosophy which, at its core, is preoccupied with and often deeply suspicious of any and all relations between government and religion. It translates that preoccupation into various strategies of governance. Separation is one, accommodation is another, all of which seek to balance two necessities: the individual citizen's need for freedom of or freedom from religion, and the state's need to maintain order. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your questions and your comments. Thank you.
If you have any questions, please make sure you speak on the microphone.
Hello, my name is Rochelle. I'm a business major at the Biddeford campus at the University of New England. I want to thank you for a wonderful and enthusiastic talk tonight. You mentioned that the term is the most mangled and confused ism in the political lexicon, and you credit George Jacob Holyoake for clarifying the term in his book, The Principles of Secularism. My question to you is, do you agree with Holyoake's ideas? And because secularism is such a complicated term, have your views changed over time since you've been studying the idea?
Thank you, Rochelle. That's a very good question. Do I agree with Holyoake? Actually, no, I don't agree with Holyoake. Holyoake was very much a man of the 19th century, and his viewpoint was that everything is about the world we live in right now, right at this moment, right? Because he was absolutely convinced that there was no world beyond, all right? Holyoake was also a disciple, this is kind of getting into the weeds, of one Robert Owen, who was a sort of utopian socialist, and I'm not a utopian socialist, so that also militates against my embrace of Holyoake. What I like about Holyoake, here's another thing I don't like about Holyoake, right? Holyoake, again, it's the age, is in an age of big science, all right? The idea that science can cure all of our ailments, that if we only let science make all rational decisions, right, everything will be better. And as much as I love science, and I'm pro-science, right, I certainly don't want to live in a society in which science is the only driver of policy. I think that's a very, very problematic way of looking at the role of science in public debate. All right? I think John Paul II was the one who spoke about science tempered by compassion. If you can get around the church's very complex relation to science historically, and you think about what's being said there, it's really quite profound, right? That we need science, right? We can't live without it, right? But we need it to be checked and balanced by something. And Holyoake, who did not have the benefit of all the calamities of the 20th century, he's writing in the 19th century, maybe placed a little bit too much stock in the capacity of science to deliver us, right? And if you were to ask me, Berlinerblau, what can deliver us? Well, it's obvious. Literature, music, obvious, right? I mean, that's what I would say. And I can imagine somebody saying, I don't like Berlinerblau because he places too much stock in art and literature. Nevertheless, there are many secularists that view art and literature as ultimately, and cinema and dance and poetry, right, as our salvation. How have my opinions changed, Rochelle? They haven't changed. They've progressed to the point where I really believe we would not have secular ways of thinking about governance if we didn't have Christianity. I always knew Christianity was a really major part of our ways of thinking about the proper relation between church and state. But after studying it now for nearly 15 years, no Christianity, no secularism, right? So let's just make sure we understand what's being said, right? This idea, right, that you've got the church here and you've got the state here, and you've really got to watch the way they interact because God says so, even more fascinatingly, because God says so, right, is a uniquely Christian idea, right, developing in Western Christendom. I want to be clear about that as well, right? So the more I study, the more I realize the debt of modern secular thought to Christian political philosophy. This gentleman. I think the microphone is coming around.
Could you elaborate? You said how inadequate the Establishment Clause is. Mm-hmm. And to my non-legal mind, I sort of thought its vagueness was its power. And to my hermeneutical mind, it's a great question. Is the vagueness or the ambiguity of those 16 words actually its strength? I would say so. Here's the bigger problem.
The problem is that the Establishment Clause in and of itself is fine, except it's parked next to the Free Exercise Clause, right? The Free Exercise Clause, to me, is the genius of American democracy and in a sense, the problem. Let me explain. If you look at all the state constitutions, right, at the time of the ratification of the Bill of Rights and the drafting of the Bill of Rights, you'll notice that whenever they speak about religion, nearly all of them, with maybe one exception, they all say the same thing. In a nutshell, you have complete free exercise of religion, all right, unless it disturbs public peace. The order principle again, which comes up in every single bit of church-state legislation of the time going forward 225 years to the present. All right? Why are the religion clauses so sparse? Well, here's a fun fact. Mr. Madison didn't want to write the Bill of Rights. Right? He felt the Constitution was enough. Right? That's something that most Americans don't know. Right? He really was ambivalent. He had to have his arm bent, and then finally he figured, okay, pragmatically, I'm going to have to go forward and write this thing. All right? But it's clear that he was extremely ambivalent about writing the text. My own analysis of the way our First Amendment evolved, and we actually have some of the early drafts, which are very, very different from the final 16 words, suggests to me that this was something Madison didn't want to do, an afterthought, and something that created all sorts of fights on the House floor. So they sort of tabled it in a way. They just came up with this kind of verbiage, right? Let's just put it out there and see what happens. And when does it bite us? It bites us in free exercise litigation. Why? All right? Because you'll always have these cases. They keep coming up over and again where an American citizen says, the Constitution grants me complete free exercise, right? Why should I do anything against my religious scruples, right? And I've pointed out the Constitution is naive compared to the state constitutions of the time, which say, no, you don't have complete free exercise. What a crazy idea. Could you imagine? You'll rarely hear me say this, but Justice Scalia was right in the Smith decision. Could you imagine governing a country where every person believed they had complete freedom to act on all their religious? It would be an unmanageable country. It would be war of all against all, right? Why our Constitution doesn't say that is part of the reasons I enumerated, this apathy that Madison had. You want to see a really good constitution on church state? Look at the 1905 law on separation of church and state in France. All right? It is thousands of words long. All right? It goes into micro detail on relations between church and state. And you can say of French laïcité, as it's called, what you will, but they don't have this constant revolving door of difficulties on church-state issues. Why? Because the foundational document is very, very clear.
Hi, I'm curious what your response to the State Department policy gurus was when they asked if it was okay if their higher-ups attended religious ceremonies. And also, I'm curious, I was really struck by what you said about how you cannot divest people's religious beliefs from them, and that's a conclusion that students of mine have come to in a course on terrorism that I teach. And I'm curious, even though it's not your field, I'm wondering if you have any ideas about policy approaches to combating terrorism when there is a religious motivation.
You mean like bad religious ideas?
Yes.
Right? Oh, yeah, that's a real problem. That's a real problem. All right, so the first one is easy. I told the State Department personnel, and whether they listened to me, I don't know. I said, of course, go ahead. You're representing the United States, right? We're a pluralistic society. We are a light unto the nations, right? We have had very, very little religious strife in our country, nothing compared to almost every other country in the world. And the reason it works is because we don't get obsessed over what Mr. Madison called unessential differences, minor points. All right? So go ahead, knock yourself out, enjoy the iftar. Right? So that's my advice to folks over at State. Whether they listen to it or not, I don't know. But Professor, the second question you ask is really complicated. All right? What do you do with fringe religious groups, right, whose liberty of conscience entitles them to have views that are completely, completely despicable, right, but potentially dangerous, all right? So what do you do with suicide cults? What do you do with white supremacist groups, right, in the United States? And this has always been the greatest challenge to what we might call the liberal status quo, right? 98% of religious people in this country are peaceful, are orderly, have no violent intent, right, are not bent on overthrowing the government, right? But what do you do with groups that have these ideas that are inimical to the health of society writ large? And it's sort of a weakness in the armor of liberalism, right? Liberalism doesn't know how to think about groups that are illiberal, to put this in Lockean terms, right? The only interesting question about toleration is what cannot be tolerated. So he writes the letter concerning toleration, right? There's only one interesting question. What is it that a state cannot tolerate? All right? What types of religious beliefs can a state not tolerate? Now, I hope many of you are feeling very uneasy about, you should be kind of tittering in your seats, right? Because that is a problematic, that there are certain beliefs that are so dangerous, right, to the well-being and the health of a society that a society must intervene. All right, so there are two ways of looking at it. There's a kind of glorious English tradition where you can believe absolutely anything you want, and there's a much tougher French tradition that takes a real interest in the types of things you believe, to the point that certain types of religious groups aren't allowed to exist in France. Right? Certain types of what they call cults, right? Scientology, for example. Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know exactly where that stands, but they've been going back and forth on this for decades. So here's my very controversial suggestion. And I mentioned it in the book, nobody picked it up, but I think it is very controversial. I am worried about groups that so value the next world that they don't care about this one. Right? And you find those groups, this is not an anti-Muslim thing. You find these groups everywhere. You find them in Judaism, or you find them in Christianity. I do think that if I were permitted, right, to run a special religious investigation unit at the FBI, all right, which obviously we don't have, and maybe for, this would be my criteria. Show me groups, right, that hate the present world, or that think it is a sinful, worthless, terrible place endowed with no value by God, right? And in fact, what God really wants is for us to get out of this world as fast as we can. We're talking about a very small fringe, right, of American religious groups, right? But if I had the executive authority to do so, those are the groups I would monitor very, very carefully, right? And those are the people that I would be looking at with extreme diligence. Is that a reasonable, as an expert on terrorism, does that sound right to you? Oh, I'm sorry, right. Gentleman in the back.
I'd like to get your take on a couple of cases that are before the Supreme Court right now. Hobby Lobby and Greece, New York. Are these opportunities for accommodation? Or are these what Madison would describe as unessential points, diversions?
Yeah, let's go to the Hobby Lobby case. I think the term I'm using is creeping accommodationism. Right? Accommodation is an idea that really gets into gear in the 80s in the courts, right? And it's a good idea, right? If there's no general threat to equality or to order, right, there are accommodations and exceptions that can be made to what are called generally applicable laws, all right? And I think it's a good idea. I'll give you an example, right? In my parents' neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, there's a very Orthodox Jewish community there, right? And normally in New York, you collect you put parking meters, right, 6 days a week, right? So Monday to Saturday, right? But this community worships on Saturday, right? So their cars are just sitting there, so they're going to get a ticket, right? So what's the accommodation? Monday to Friday and Sunday. So Saturday is like Sunday. The state cannot ticket them for for parking illegally on Saturdays, but on Sundays they can. That's a brilliant accommodation, right? I know very few people ever that would say, oh, that's terrible. That really upsets me. That's a church-state trespass, right? That's where accommodation works, right? The problem in Hobby Lobby is different, right? Because by accommodating one type of American, right, the owners of Hobby Lobby who feel that to permit the insurance packages that they are paying for, even though the Obama administration offered a very reasonable loophole there and a way out of it, right, that to permit that would be an affront to their freedom of conscience. Well, that's all well and good, right, but their free, this goes back to this gentleman's question, their free exercise of religion impinges upon the rights of other Americans, right? And this is where the coming battle is going to take place. You saw that in the Arizona case, which is the case I thought you were going to mention, all right? The case of the right to discriminate against gay or lesbian persons because your religion tells you you can, all right? So this is a classic example of where accommodation goes terribly wrong. Think about my innocuous ultra-Orthodox Jews parking on Sunday, all right, where I don't think anybody is disadvantaged by that. And think about this, right? You walk into a store and you're a gay or lesbian American and somebody says, I refuse to serve you, all right, because my scriptures tell me that you live in sin, you're an abomination, and so on and so on, all right? So I think this is the battle we have to have, but because secularism is in such a state of disrepair, because all the legal talent is on the conservative Christian side, quite frankly, and all the academic talent, right, is there, and the money. Secular jurists haven't figured out, right, how to, like almost like jiu-jitsu or martial arts, right, how to get a case in front of these justices, right, that exemplifies this. But who is the patron saint? Strangely, Scalia, right? Scalia in the Smith decision was unequivocal, citing the 1879 Reynolds decision, saying there is no complete free exercise, right? Free exercise stops at a certain point. If not, society would be completely unmanageable. And then, of course, he overturned Scalia's kind of a revolving door of jurisprudence, right? He kind of undermined himself later on. So the coming confrontation and the coming crisis in American secularism is accommodation, right? And the danger is, right, when an accommodation to one group, right, completely disenfranchises or penalizes another, right? And I'm very, very postscript. I'm very wary about what the result of that case will. Everything I read suggests it doesn't look good, right, for those who believe that these companies have to offer this type of insurance, right, in their insurance packages. This woman over here, if you could just wait for the microphone. It's coming. It's on its way. In 3, 2, 1.
You talked about being wary of groups of cults where people are wishing for the rapture. Let's just bring it on. I have a great forgettery, but if I remember something, a little shred, that in Reagan's administration, was it the head of the environmental whatever who was urging the rapture to come on? I'm thinking we need to do more than just look at groups who were looking to end this. I
actually wrote, all right, so I wrote a book called Thumpin' It, The Use and Abuse of the Bible in Today's Presidential Politics, and I dealt with this issue, right? Apparently the claim that the Reagan official, was it Watts? Does anyone remember the name? It was Watts, right?
Watts.
The claim that Watts said that he didn't care about the environment, right, because he just wanted the rapture to come, and it was all a moot point anyhow. He has categorically denied it, all right? He says he never, and I would tend to believe him, actually. In fact, my research indicated he never did say it. It was one of these rumors. However, the sentiment is out there, right? If you speak to evangelical Christians, and we have to be fair to evangelical Christians, right, they get a tremendously bad rap, right? Especially in this part of the country, right? If I were to tell you evangelical Christians were on the forefront of stopping human sexual trafficking, if I were to tell you evangelical Christians were on the forefront of stopping the global spread of AIDS, right? If global poverty, that these are issues that they give blood and time and money for, right? I hope you would put that in your docket of thinking about these groups, right? I clearly don't agree with most of what they do, but I think
we also have to separate evangelical from fundamentalist.
Well, yes.
There is a difference.
As they would themselves, right? As they would themselves, though you will find some evangelicals. What did Jerry Falwell famously say? A fundamentalist is an evangelical with an attitude. It's a funny quote, right? A fundamentalist is an evangelical with an attitude. So you're right. There are groups. They are on the fringes, right, amongst the Christian right, all right, who do hope for the end of the world. And if Berlinerblau's FBI were in play, right, these would be the types of groups that would be monitored, all right? They would be watched very, very carefully. You know, the one intelligent thing Hosni Mubarak said of the 19 hijackers was very clever. He said they're a death cult, Right? I thought it was a very interesting, when he was asked, what did you think about the 9/11 attack? He said, that's a death cult. It has nothing to do with Islam. These are people that want to die, and they want to kill as many people as they can in the process. And to me, that's the great danger for liberal political theory, for any ethic of tolerance. Right? This is where we run into problems. We don't know how to deal with these types of groups.
Just individuals, too, please.
Yeah, individuals.
Microphones.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions? The gentleman.
I'm a little bit curious as to when you go down south
Right.
and you lecture in less maybe friendly
Right.
terms. What is their opinion when you refer to as in the 60s that the Republicans and the Democrats were in agreement on this?
They agree. Remember, evangelicals, and then I'll tell you a story. I love telling stories. Evangelicals, until the age of Reagan, generally voted Democrat. Right? They were part of the FDR coalition. We forget that, right? I mean, what Reagan and Falwell wrought, right, is truly one of the most important developments in 20th century American politics, complete realignment of the American electorate. And we forget that, right? For liberal activists out there, it's the clearest sign that change is possible, right? With diligence, with intelligence, with hard work, right? It can be done, all right? So the story I want to tell is I went out to a college way out in Texas. So far out in Texas, it was near Oklahoma, all right, which is imponderable to me. And I was lecturing a room of mostly evangelical professors, and one woman raised her hand and she said, after spending time in Utah, I became a secularist, right? So I wanted to interrogate that a little bit more. It's like, what do you mean by that, professor? And what she said was she was transferred before she became a scholar to Utah on business, and her kid was in a public school, and one day the kid came home and said, Mommy, what's the something of the locusts, right? Something of the locusts. And she went to ask her evangelical pastor, and the guy looked it up, and then he did an Edward Munch, the scream face, and he said, that's Mormon theology. They're teaching you Mormon theology in the public schools, which happens all the time around this country. Mormon theology in Utah, kind of Baptist theology in the Deep South, right? And she had the secular epiphany. And the secular epiphany was she was now a religious minority as an evangelical Christian in Utah, and the state was tacitly endorsing aspects of Mormon theology which she, to say the least, did not agree with. All right? So I think that's the great secular moment, and it's something I learned in the South. I think the trick of secularism is to make majoritarian groups have the experience that this woman had in Utah, right? To understand what the stakes are in all of this, right? I think it's an odd circumstance. It doesn't happen very often that people get transferred to other states, right? But this is really secularism's job of persuasion, all right? To convince the majority, especially in the South, that their own interest in religious freedom is furthered by basic secular policies.
This is a question from Northern Maine, Holton, Maine. It says, it sounds like you think that human intelligence is the greatest intelligence. Is this true?
Well, it's the only intelligence I know of, right? Yeah, sure. I think human intelligence is the greatest intelligence and the worst. It's both, right? It's the only form of intelligence we know of, with all due respect to our friends in the animal kingdom and the bears and the moose. Yeah, I would say human intelligence, yeah.
I wouldn't mind the second question, but
Sure.
Do you see the Tea Party and, as you describe them in your book, the Revivalists as two distinct groupings? Do you see overlap between the two? Do they constitute the type of coalition that you would like to see among liberal Catholics, Reformed Jews, and mainstream Protestants?
Right. When the Tea Party first busted out in 2010, the next day I had a show, which I used to do from the Washington Post with Sally Quinn, and we used to interview people on religion and politics, and we had the communications director of the National Association of Evangelicals on. You can Google this up. It's a very funny interview. And I said to him, so, his name was Galen Carey, I said, so, Mr. Carey, what do you think about the Tea Party? You must be very, very happy that the Tea Party has carried the day. And he was, Tea Party? Who's the Tea Party? Who's the Tea Party? Never heard of the Tea Party, right? So in other words, there was this very kind of studied Tea Party. I don't know what the Tea Party is, right? So there was this kind of attempt to completely pull apart the two, right? Now, he might have been being very forthright, though I doubt it. I think originally the strength of the Tea Party was this. The Tea Party could say things publicly that evangelical Christians could not because they were withheld by Christian scruples, right? So the Tea Party would say these hair-raisingly offensive things about all sorts of Americans, right? Because they were allegedly not religious. They were just the Tea Party. I think the most recent research, I'm thinking of the guy, his name is Brody, who writes for the Christian News Service, right? He wrote a book called The Tea-Vangelicals. Tells you everything you need to know, right? That there is incredible overlap, right, between a Tea Party voter and an evangelical Christian Party voter. And it might have even been part of the plan to begin with, right, to create this other entity, right, which really wasn't that other, right, which was part of the same entity. In terms of the coming coalition that he mentions, I discussed this in my book, I feel the future for a progressive politics on secular issues in the United States lies in the following coalition. Mainline Protestants, who are not evangelical Protestants, right? Religious minorities led by the Reformed Jews, of which I am one, that would unite together conservative Jews, conservative Judaism, Reconstruction, secular humanistic Judaism, liberal Catholics, liberal Mormons, Muslims, Hindus, Baha'i, the so-called other, and non-believers. To me, that is the coalition that has to form fast on the grassroots level in order for any change, any legitimate change, right, to be seen in American politics. Where do we stand now? One of the arguments in the book is because new atheist rhetoric is so vehemently anti-religious, many of the religious groups I just mentioned do not feel comfortable joining in such a coalition. And I do feel that is a political organizational problem, right? Most atheists, by the way, that I know personally are not searingly anti-religious. They're live and let live people, all right? They're generally libertarian in their thinking. They're independent-minded. If you want to believe in God, that's fine with them, as long as you don't impose your beliefs in God upon them, which is completely legitimate. I think that type of atheist has to kind of gain control, right, of the atheist movement, and only then will common cause between religious liberals, right, and non-believers be possible.
On this note, we would like to conclude the event, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.